Hello and well met. This is Eberron with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today I'm going to be going over some options that you'll have or you'll be facing when you are building characters in Fantasy Grounds with the DnD5e rule set. There are a ton of options out there depending on what setting you're in, what level you are, and what type of character you like to build. Some of the things you want to keep in mind as a game master are what type of books do you want to make available to your players. So that can be quite confusing depending on how much content you own and the type of characters your players want to build, and if you're willing to create your own homebrew content, those sort of things. So we'll kind of touch on that. Talk about the book choices. There isn't really a definitive list that really works well. However, if you are someone who owns everything or you have a lot of the content, if you come over to the library and you go to modules, and as you can see, I got a bunch of modules loaded here. Some of these are the Rob2e third-party content, but all the rest of this are campaign settings that have additional options in them. And there are also other books that have backgrounds. And then, of course, there are races. So it really depends on what your needs are. But there are some books that really don't need to be added to Fantasy Grounds unless you want a certain aspect of it coming over from that book to your character sheet. So, for instance, the main book is the Player's Handbook. That's going to cover, 70-60% of what you need to build a character. That book would more than likely, you'd want to keep that open the whole time. So the Player's Handbook is kind of like the backbone of everything. If you've got the Player's Handbook, you're pretty well off. You don't need a whole lot more. If you want to expand your library with player choices, it really depends on where you're going to be playing inside of a campaign. So for instance, you don't necessarily have to open up the Van Richten's Guide for players if you're not playing in the Ravenloft setting. However, there may be a horror setting that you would like to use some of those features in. So in that case, yes, you'd want to have that book activated and have it available or shared to your players. So this is kind of a preference choice type thing, but if I had any sort of influence or say on what I would buy or what I would use, I would probably only get the Player's Handbook, Monsters of the Multiverse, which covers most of your non-human races, and then maybe one or two of the other books that are available when it comes to selecting races. So they've consolidated a lot of the races inside of Monsters of the Multiverse. So if you open that book up and you click on Monsters of the Multiverse, the player's version, and then you click on races, it gives you a nice list of all the different races that are covered. And it's quite a few. I mean, there's the turtle is in there, so you don't need the turtle package if you want to build a turtle, character. There's no, let's see, is a satyr in here? Yeah, so you wouldn't necessarily need the Odyssey campaign adventure, but I do have it loaded here. But once you're past first level, and when you're building a character, you generally don't need all these books. So it's only at first level. If you want to offer your players a lot of choices, then yeah, you'd probably have quite a few books loaded. Just remember that a lot of this is redundant, and there are some copies and some variations between the different books. This is not a Fantasy Grounds thing. This is more to do with how Wizards of the Coast put out their books. So there is some things that are duplicated. And when you go to select a race in the actual settings here under characters, if you pull up the races tab and then you look at what's available in your particular session, there's a lot of duplicates in here. So like for instance, the halfling is covered in the Player's Handbook, but it's also covered in Eberron and the Sword Coast Adventures. So the base one, the Player's Handbook version, might be slightly different than the Eberron or the Sword Coast version because they are kind of themed for that setting. A lot of people have complained that, oh, there's too many copies of the same thing in this view window. Well, if you don't want to see everything here and you're just focusing on the base classes and races, you can use the group filter above, and I'll filter it to the Player's Handbook, and that's only going to show me the stuff in that book. Same thing with any other setting. If you wanted to build stuff from Monsters of the Multiverse, you can filter to that. So you don't have to see every single duplicate race. So a lot of that has to do with how the books are engineered or put together. That's why you're going to see duplication, because you have several books open. So there's not much that can be done about that. There is something, though, that they've done about the classes, which may get better in the future, but for the time being, kind of the same problem. When you open up a class and you see that there's like 10 different variations of the same class, that's because you have multiple books open. And those multiple books will have subclasses or specializations that are offered only in those books. So the way Fantasy Grounds was originally designed and built was to display the base class and then all the sub races and all the subdomains and all those things and all the subclasses and those sort of things. So when you have multiple books open, you're going to have 2 or 3 different variations depending on what content you have. That can be a little annoying when it comes to having options or building a character for a specific setting. So if you're worried about that, you can use the filter up here on the top. And let's just say I only want the options for races or classes from the player's handbook. So there's some basics here. When you open these up and you actually scroll down to the bottom, there might be some sub races in here or subclasses like Path of the Battle Rager and Path of the Totem Warrior expanded. But if you bring up the player's handbook version, which is the base version, let's take a look at just the player's handbook, and let's look at the Barbarian. There you have all the base ones, the standard ones. So you have Path of the Berserker and Path of the Totem Warrior. So this is how you end up getting all those duplications, is because all these subclasses or all the sub-races and stuff are included in different content. So there's really no other way to put that into Fantasy Grounds other than to repeat it, which is part of the problem of the content that you're getting from the publisher. So they'll republish things, they'll put it in a kind of repeated format, except for they'll have their little twists on it that comes from the different settings or from the different themes. So this is why it's kind of annoying in Fantasy Grounds when you see like 50 gazillion bards. You got like 3 bards and 6 clerics, and you have all these different things. Well, if you use the filter, that helps narrow down which types of content is coming from which books. For instance, I have the Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, the player's book, open. There's a bard and a warlock option. So if I click warlock and scroll down to the bottom, you get an otherworldly patron of the undead. So that's a different warlock. Same thing with bard. So if I scroll down to the bottom, you're getting the College of Spirits. So those are not offered in other books. So what happens is when you want to pick a class, you're going to get you're not just going to get the subclass, you're going to also get the base class, because this is how the original design of Fantasy Grounds was set up. It was built around the classes. They are starting to move away from that. So in the future, you'll only see subclasses instead of the actual base class. So if you click on the subclasses up here on classes, it'll give you subclass specializations depending on what you have. And right now, only this Glory of Giants has that option at the moment, because this was built after the changes were made. So the only way to fix that would be to go back into all the old books and redo them all, which I don't think Fantasy Grounds or Smiteworks is interested in doing. So it still works this way, it's just not as clean. So that's one of the reasons why it's kind of frustrating and annoying to create characters and you got all these options, and it can be really confusing, especially if you're new to Fantasy Grounds. But if you just have the books that you need open at the time, that cuts down a lot of that. And also just remember that you don't have to have all the books open after first level. So actually, if I build this character and after first level, I can get rid of a majority of these because I won't need any more of those than that it's needed when it comes to first level. So at first level, you get your race, you pick your base class, and you pick your background and a feat. Once that's done, you don't need all the other books. You just need a player's handbook and whatever book your subclass comes out of, whether it be your specialization. Normally, all of the classes in the 5th edition rule set attain their specific subclass at 3rd level or sooner. Once that's done, you only need to level up every now and then. So you don't have to have all of these books open after that. So after a while, you can close a lot of these unless they contain a spell or a feat or some kind of class feature that's unique to that specific setting and that specific book. So as you build characters, you'll want to figure out which of the books that you'll need open. And you'll learn that as you go. So in this case, I've already built this half-elf bard, and the actual background or in the half-elf race, I don't need the books anymore because I've already chose those at 1st level. So if I go to the activation window, I can disable those particular books. However, you might have other players that are also building things out of those particular books. So you have to kind of keep that in mind for the entire table, not just one player. So there could be a time where you need to keep open the Sword Coast Adventures Guide because there's stuff in there that may be required for one of your players to level up later. But in most cases, it just gives you backgrounds and I think some other things like that. So if I go into Sword Coast Adventures Guide, and then I look here, there's spells in here, there's races, there's classes, and backgrounds. So you probably have to keep that open if you're adventuring on the Sword Coast and you have a character that has built a class around that. So let's take a look at the classes that are offered. So there are variations of quite a few. Not all of them, but a lot of them have variations here. So in case of the Paladin, if you scroll down here, it's going to give you a certain type of Paladin, and it might even give you some different lore and some things that fit in with the setting. But you have Oath of the Crown in here, so you'd have to keep this open if you built a Paladin with the Oath of the Crown. So throughout your career as a player, this book would probably need to be active at least when you're leveling up. But after 1st level, in most cases, you don't need to have every single book open. This is just on the initial character build when your characters are first building your characters. They'll have some options there that you provide them. And once they've made their choices, generally don't need all of the books. So like for instance, Saltmarsh, this is an adventure campaign. This already has some backgrounds in it that you may or may not want to use. So if you're not doing a maritime or an oceanic adventure, you probably don't need to load it. But you have the fisherman, you have the marine, the shipwright, and the smuggler. So if you have any of those types of themes that you want to use in your game, you might want to leave this open at least for 1st level. Once the character has chose their background, you don't need to have that book open unless you're going to use the ships out of there. In that case, there are ships and references to ships in the Dungeon Master's book, not the player's book. So you'd have to have the actual adventure loaded in that case. But there are different little bits and pieces that exist in 2 spots sometimes only in one book and not the other. So this can get really confusing when you're building a character and keeping track of which books are holding which content. So there are lists out there that kind of give you an idea, but if you own, like for instance, the Monsters of the Multiverse, that actually replaced Mordenkainen's in some regard, and it replaced the Elemental Evil in some regard, and it even replaced the, what was that, Volo's Guide to Monsters. So that's kind of the thing that kind of made it confusing. They kind of consolidated all of those races from other books into one book. Unfortunately, it didn't bring the backgrounds with them. So even if the races were covered in that book, if there were backgrounds that came from those other books, they didn't include those, just the races. So that doesn't come in handy when you're building a character and then you go, wait a minute, what happened to the background? Well, you disabled the book and you thought you were done with it. but you didn't realize that, hey, this has other backgrounds in it that are not available in the core book. So there are things that can really bother you. Hey, Dan, how's it going? So those are just things to kind of keep in mind when you're building characters with Fantasy Grounds. And a lot of people don't like the changes that were made in Monsters of the Multiverse because they changed some of the lore. So if you are somebody who already owns the older books that have been discontinued, you can continue to use those in Fantasy Grounds. They're just no longer going to be updated or maintained as much in Fantasy Grounds. But if you already have those and you like the lore or you like the way it looked or whatever, you can still use those. You don't have to use the ones out of Monsters of the Multiverse. Some people were pretty pissed off about the changes they made to make those a little bit more woke and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, they're there and they exist. And if you have those books already, you can still use them. They're just no longer for sale and you're not going to be able to buy them. Not too much, just finish it. Oh, cool. Right on. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to go over with you, that when you're building a character, when you're starting at first level, you're likely going to have a lot more books that you'll want to load when you're first starting. But as time goes on, let's say after first level, you can disable some of them. Like, you don't have to have every single book open after first level. However, if you're going to go up to second level, you have to make sure you have the correct books open to level up at that point, at least until you get to third level. After third level, everyone has their archetype. However, there are features that will add up from first to third level depending on what your subclass is. So that just really depends on the build. So there's so many different combinations and so many different features in each book. Like, some give you background, some give you spells, some give you feats. You know, it's a big mixture of things. So when you're playing a rule set like D&D or some of the other, like Pathfinder and such, there's so many options that it can get pretty confusing, especially if you're new and you haven't used Fantasy Grounds or you're just new to role-playing games. That can be really, really confusing. But the bottom line, I'd say, for the DnD5e rule set is the Player's Handbook. Hands down, I think that's the best option. That's kind of your base. You can build stuff upon it. If you know what you're doing in Fantasy Grounds and you have some experience, you can build your own races and subclasses. You don't have to go by, whatever, you don't have to conform to the books that come out. You can actually make your own. So there are tools to do that in some rule sets that allow you to build your own races and classes. I know the 5th edition one does. I'm not sure about other rule sets. I'm sure they allow for some of it. But in the case of DnD5e, there's actually import tools, there's videos, there's all kinds of support for it. So if you're wanting to save money and you don't want to spend a bunch of money, and let's say you got stuff from D&D Beyond or something like that, if you just have the base rulebook and you want other races and classes, you can put all that stuff in yourself. Unfortunately, at this time, not all of that stuff will carry over in the character wizard. So if you're using the character wizard to build and manage your character, if you make custom content, that's not always going to transfer over or get pulled into the character wizard. The character wizard was initially designed to work with the core books, with the actual official books. Any third-party content or stuff that you made homebrew may or may not carry over into the character wizard. So if that's the case, you're going to have to resort to drag and drop when you're doing your level ups and such and building your characters. So instead of using the character wizard, you just drag over your background, your race, and your class from the corresponding sections in the character build. So it's more, I want to say it's a little bit more complete and a little bit more thorough when you build through the interface. It takes longer, but it is a little bit more demanding too, and it does take a certain amount of experience to do the drag and drop. The character wizard is a lot quicker. I think I timed myself, it was like maybe 10 or 15 minutes quicker overall to use that. So that helps when you have new players and you don't want to get into all the minutia and you just want to crank out some characters. The character wizard does a pretty good job with that. It still has flaws. There's still things broken with it. I'm still using drag and drop in a lot of cases. I don't use the character wizard unless I want to whip up a basic character really quick, like a first level character. It works well for that, but after that, I might resort to the drag and drop method. And when I go to level up, I'll do it manually within the character sheet instead of the character wizard. So if you're going to build with a manual type setup, the main thing to remember is ABRC. So abilities, background, race, and class. So that's the order you want to try to stick with for the 5th edition rule set. So abilities, background, race, class, and level. ABRC, a battle ready character. If you can remember that, that's the build order. And then when you level up, you can click on this actual little link here. This looks like a tennis racket or a magnifying glass. And once you already have your class and such, you can level up from here. So you could click on the character wizard and it'll allow you to level up from here. But if you do it manually through the interface instead of the character wizard, you're going to bring up your character sheet. You bring up that shortcut link that I had up here. And all you have to do, provided that you have the correct books open and everything, is that you just drag this little link underneath the plus button here. And that's going to give another level. So I just drag that in here. Now I'm level 4. So it's pretty easy to level up. The only thing it may or may not do is add the automation that you might want or need with this particular character. And you'll have to do that manually anyways. So that's something that you'll have to kind of get used to if you're traditionally using the character wizard versus this drag and drop method. So ABRC is a battle ready character, and then you just level up by clicking on the link over here on the right, which is the class link, and you just drag and drop that onto the character here anywhere in this window, and it will add another layer and level you up. And it does it automatically. It gives you the average hit points. And if there's any traits or feats or anything that comes with that, or it'll prompt you to do that. This gave me an ability score increasement at 4th level. So when you do the drag and drop, yeah, that's how you have to do it in Starfinder. You have to drag and drop, or do you use a character wizard? But if you ability score improvement, that is a manual process in doing it this way. But if you use the character wizard, it offers you a window where you can adjust it from there. So if that's the case for this, okay, drag and drop, yep. So if that's the case for the ability scores here, I can just manually change these. So I get 2 points to distribute. So what I will do, and it will tell you here in the actual character sheet, on your abilities tab, it'll say ability score improvement. If you click on the description, it says you can increase 2 and then 1, or you can use Tasha's method and do 1, 1, and 1, you know, that sort of thing, depending on what you're doing. So if that's the case, I can come over here to my character sheet. I'm definitely going to add 1 to my dexterity. That's going to give me 17. And then I'm going to add 2 to my intelligence or charisma. So this is a bard, so probably my charisma. So I might swap those two. So I'm going to go with a 14 or 15, 16 dex. And then I will have a 15 charisma. So that's just a, adjustments. You can do that manually if you need to. But this is just something that you're going to have to figure out as you go through Fantasy Grounds, depending on your rule set. Some rule sets do still require drag and drop, depending on how they're designed. Eventually, Smiteworks wants to make a character builder for most of the core rule sets, if not all. But in the interim, most core rule sets require that you drag and drop, and they don't necessarily have a character wizard built into it. They were trying to kind of standardize character creation, but what they're finding is that there's a whole bunch of variations and people wanting to do homebrew and a mixture of third-party content. Like maybe you want some races or backgrounds or classes that come from other content, like from the DM's Guild or perhaps a third party like Cobalt Press or something like that. So that doesn't always compute either with the character wizard. So you'll have to use drag and drop if you're going to use a lot of homebrew content. So that's one unfortunate side effect of how the character wizard is built now. And I think in the future they will be able to address that, but I don't think it's a priority right now. So you can still build drag and drop, or you can use the character wizard if you're building like a basic character. But if you want something very customized and you're going to use a whole bunch of custom content, I honestly would advise to use the drag and drop method, just so that you don't miss anything and that it doesn't leave or exclude you out. Because you get halfway through the character builder and you realize the options aren't there. That's going to kind of suck. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're building characters in certain rule sets. Once you're kind of on a path, it's really hard to go back. So once you hit save in the character wizard, or once you drag over a choice within Fantasy Grounds, it's pretty much a done deal. There's really no good way to fix it other than going back and manually taking away and deleting the stuff that was added when you were building the character. So there is a kind of a commitment after you do that. The only way around that, I would think, is if you are going to build a character from level 1, just make a copy of it before you level up. So if you go into the characters area, and let's say I want to go to 5th level, but I don't want to edit or change the base. So if you left click on a given character and you just drag it over, and this is for the DM, you can make a copy of that half-elf, so of the bard. So if I open that copy up, I'm going to level this one up instead. That way, if it breaks or I make the wrong choices or I need to go backwards, I can just right-click and delete the copy, and then I'll still have the original and just make another copy and then build from there. That's the best way to manage a character, I think, in regards to progression. So if it's a character you're going to build from level 1 to level 20, I would make copies of it each time before you level up. So after you've made your, you got your equipment and everything figured out, and it's time to level up, I would ask the GM to make a copy of it and then level up the copy. That way you have a version of every single level, so from 1st to 20th, and then you will also have all your changes saved with each iteration. And what's handy about that is not only are you saving yourself from having to go back and rebuild that character. Let's say you made a mistake at 7th level. That would really suck to try to figure out where that character was at 7th level in regards to equipment and all that other stuff. So save yourself the nightmare and make a copy of the character before you level up, because that will save you a lot of headache. Yes, you'll have a lot of copies of it, but that's healthy. And as a matter of fact, the GM can export these one at a time as on each level, put it in a folder along with your portrait photo and tokens and whatever else, maybe a little backstory or something, and put it in a folder and zip it and then send it to that player. So you can use that character from 1st to 20th level in different games. So you'll have a different variation of the same character at different levels. So that's a good way to kind of back that up. It is kind of a long route. It is a little extra work, but I think it's worth it in the long run. If it's just a one-shot, who cares? But if you're going to use that same character for a long time, or you want to use that character in other games, it's nice to have that character at different levels throughout their progression. So that's a way to kind of mitigate making a mistake or accidentally dragging the wrong thing over, or Fantasy Grounds crashing in the middle of whatever you're doing. There's all kinds of things that could go wrong, and you lose that character, it gets corrupted. That's a real pain in the butt to fix. So my advice is at every level, you make a copy and you level up the copy. So in this case, this is going to be my half-elf bard. So I'm going to go ahead and level them up. So if I go to the class and level and drag this over, and then all I'm doing is just drag and drop it in the same window, and that adds another layer, another level. And then I'm just going to change this copy to, I'll just say level 5 right now, just so I know it's not a copy anymore, and go ahead and close that. So now here's the 5th level version of it. Then when I go to 6th level, I'll make a copy of that one, and then I will do the same process. So I'll close this, open up the character, go to the class and level window, and again, drag this over to where he's going to be level 6 now, and then just kind of change the description. So that way you don't have a broken character that's hard to fix or hard to figure out what you had at the time. You know, there's all those sort of things. So now I have a level 6 variation. So I have 4th, 5th, and 6th. So that's just a matter of managing the characters and kind of making a backup. And if anything goes wrong, you can always redo that step. Once you save it in the character wizard, or once you drag over an option onto the character, that saves it then and there, and you can't really easily go backwards. There's no undo unless you manually go in and fix, delete, change things that were added as you were leveling up. So it just kind of depends on what your needs are and what your campaign's like. But that is a tip that I think is very important for most people, especially in a long-term campaign. It'd be very useful to have that sort of backup. It is a little bit of extra, baggage, but I think it's worth the effort. So if you're going to be building characters, just remember you don't need every single book open. Maybe at first level to give your player more options, but after that, start shutting some of the books down that you don't need unless they contain a spell or a feat or some sort of level progression thing for their subclass. And that's the only time you need the books open. Most of the time, once players are done building at first level, you can shut down like half of your library, depending. So for this character, since I'm at 6th level already, I probably don't need half of the stuff that's on here. So if I go into the books here, I don't need the Eberron book anymore. I don't need the player's version of Curse of Strahd. I don't need the Fizbins because there's nothing that comes out of there. I don't need the monster manual in this case. I don't need the DM's guide because I'm not doing anything. So I can unload those. Salt Marsh, I don't need that. Monsters of the Multiverse, probably don't need that. Oh, great advice. Yeah, I tuned in right on time. Yeah. So generally speaking, I was just saying that, if you're going to be building characters, once you get past first level, you can kind of shut down some of the books, not all of them. But like, for instance, I'm not going to be using the Adventures Guide for Spelljammer, so I'll go ahead and unload that. I'll keep the Sword Coast Guide because that has a lot of backgrounds, races, classes in it that pertain to the Forgotten Realms. So if you're adventuring in the Forgotten Realms, it's likely at least one of your players will have something from that book. So I'd probably keep that one open. Monsters of the Multiverse is pretty universal, but once the characters are built, this one mostly deals with races. So I can actually unload that after first level, but I'll keep the GM side open because that has more NPC monsters. So I can unload that after first level. Let's see. So here's the Adventures Guide. Yeah, I'll keep that open if you're in that setting. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, the player's version, I might keep that open. The Witchlight one, I don't need that because I'm not adventuring there. Tomb of Annihilation, I don't need any of the backgrounds out of there or the races, so I got that covered. Let's see. Xanathar's, maybe. There might be a couple spells or subclasses in there. Van Richten's, unless I'm playing in Ravenloft, I don't need that. So that cuts down probably half of the library. So that's generally what you want to do as you progress in a campaign, is not add more stuff. You want to kind of bring things back, take stuff down if you can. What that does is it saves a little bit on overhead from having to transfer that material back and forth or to be activated for your players when they're not even using it. So really, this is all I have for rule books, is these things here. And on the Rob 2e things, once you're done building the character, generally speaking, you don't need a ton of those open either. So this background and class equipment, that's at first level generally. So you can unload that once you're done. You don't have to use that anymore. If you already got your feats and all of your, those sort of things, you can actually unload that. Class features, you probably keep that open because as you level up, class features will build up. The race traits, won't need that if you've already selected your race. Spells, yeah, definitely keep the spells. There is a module for all the rest of the magic items, so it depends on what setting you are, but Robin and Rob made the magic items that come with all the other, like, the adventures and stuff. Depending on what adventure you're in, you may or may not need that, but I'm going to go ahead and unload it. Adventuring gear, I would definitely keep that open, so when you add torches and that sort of thing, those will automatically get added to your sheet if you have the right extensions and the modules open. Armor, potions, rings, probably not rods and staffs and wands, probably not so much, so I'll go ahead and close those down. But there's wondrous items, there's weapons, potions, rings, armor, adventuring gear, spells, and class features. Is there a way to save the settings of your trimmed down modules so you have a trim running set? Well, it kind of saves it with the campaign. But if you're talking about, from campaign session to campaign session, maybe I think there is an XML file called module state. I think you can copy that over into your new campaign setting, which would keep all those, what you have activated and such. But no, not so much. The saving your settings is when I exit this and I come back, it's only going to have the books that I have loaded anyways. And then you have a fully loaded one for leveling. Yeah, see, if you wanted to do that, it would have to be a separate campaign. And that would be kind of a pain in the butt, because then you'd be exporting the characters out of that into your campaign setting. Let's see, Glory of Giants. So if none of my players use that content, I'll unload that. So really, I just kind of pare down the library to bare minimums. So now when I go to load up my modules list, it's a lot less. There's a lot less content that I have loaded here. I probably don't even need Xanathar's guide, but I'm going to leave it open in case. I don't remember if I took anything out of there or not. So this also comes down to familiarity with Fantasy Grounds and familiarity with the rule set and what your players used on their characters. So if you want to remember which books you had, you can take a screenshot and use that as your guide. So if you do this in another campaign, you kind of already have an idea of what you had loaded at the time. Or like I said, you use that module XML, which saves in your campaign directory, and that should have a list or a manifest of all of the different books that you had loaded. But I don't think there's a real good way of saving the settings of your trimmed down modules without doing those things. So this is just a way. You can make a list too. Like if you, do some research, make a little text file, and just paste it into Fantasy Grounds in your notes or something. That'll at least give you that, and you can actually link the modules into your notes, so you can kind of remember which ones you had loaded after first level. Then you can say, okay, I can close all these out, or however you want to handle it. But that's kind of a tip that you'll want to learn over time. I know a lot of newer players or DMs will keep every single book open, and it's not required. If you only need really the adventure, and yeah, screen cap is a good way to do it. Not really efficient, but you can actually trim it up and make it into like your own reference material. So you can actually put it in a module and all the links and everything, so that it's kind of candy for you, so you can load that up in every campaign you're in. So you could kind of make like a miniature kind of manifest that you use for your games. But it's a little work, but once it's done, it's done. Let's see. So this is kind of the trimmed down version, because this player is already level 4. So I don't really need all this. So from levels 1 to 3, you kind of need more books. But after that, you only need the book that the class features are in, or your spells or whatever. So this depends on where you get the spells from, what books they come out of. But keep in mind that if you have something that you're not sure of, usually Fantasy Grounds will bark at you or yell. It'll say, hey, you need to have this book, and so you just enable it at that time. It's not the end of the world, but it is something to keep in mind. So in this case, I have the Rob 2e effects automation modules loaded. I have some character creation modules open. And I do have an extension, or 3 of them, I think. I have Mad Nomad's base core, which is free. I have the Mad Nomad's automatic actions. and then I have the Rob2e module updater installed in this particular campaign. So what these do is they help you build your character quicker. It pulls in the automation from these modules instead of dragging them over manually by yourself. So it'll build a lot of these actions for you minus the spells. So if you have like some elven, half elven abilities, or bard, or even these standard actions here, sometimes you get feats and all those sort of things. So this is something you can use to kind of help with speed up the process a little bit. I don't know if it works well with the character builder, so I usually do drag and drop, so I know it won't interfere with one or the other. So I don't know if this works very well. I know it can work. I've seen it work, but there are so many changes that are going on in the background with Fantasy Grounds that I wouldn't trust it. I'm more used to doing this old school way of building characters, so that's, using the character wizard is kind of new to me. It is faster, and like I said, it saves you, 10, 15, 20 minutes, and it makes it a little less confusing for players because everything kind of prompts them to do things, and you can build the character in a certain, different order. But once you hit save, you're committed to it. But at least that kind of gives you a little bit more flexibility. When you do drag and drop, as soon as you drag something over, you're committed to it. So that's the danger in using the manual method. And then also your skills, they might double up because there's nothing from the manual way of building character that's going to warn you that you already have a history. So you might have a background that gives you history, but then if you drag over like cleric, history might be an option that it gives you as well. So that's why you want to build A, B, R, C, a battle-ready character, because that will help you avoid that, and it will give you an option. So normally when you pick a background, it forces the, oh look, it said Tomb of Annihilation. So here it says I should have that book open because I picked Archaeologist. So I'm going to go ahead and check that. So it will tell me, if I have books that are reliant on content. So I had to load that one because I had the background in there. In order to read it, you have to have the book activated. So these are the sort of things that you'll go through as you learn Fantasy Grounds. But for instance, if you go to background, it's going to give you history and survival. Okay. So if you do this with the character wizard, it's going to warn you or tell you to pick another option because you already have it. But in this way, it doesn't do it. So if I drag over a cleric or something like that, or a class that offers me history, and I don't realize that I already have it as a skill, it'll double up and it won't tell me. But with the character wizard, it won't complete that section until you pick a different one. So that's one nice thing about the character wizard, is that it will help avoid that. But as a rule of thumb for first level characters in D&D, if you don't have 4 or more skills, then something's broken. Normally, you have at least 4 or more. That's a good way to check in case, because most classes only give you 4 or 5 to start with. But then after that, you gain some depending on what race, class, and all that you are. But this will help prevent that from doubling up if you're going to use the manual creation method. So manual is a lot more thorough, takes more time, but a lot less chances for missing a feature or messing it up if it's not being blocked by the character wizard. Whereas the character wizard makes it a lot faster, but it may not pull in custom options from third-party content or from the DM's Guild or wherever you're building your content inside of your campaign. So it just depends on what you want and what your needs are. But generally speaking, this is just a way to help avoid some of the issues that may come up with character creation. Now, to be honest with you, character creation is probably the worst part of any type of campaign for me as a game master. Because one, everything in the world goes wrong with it. I mean, there's doubling up. There's, someone's thinking that you can have this when there's a prerequisite. Someone wants to, there's nothing preventing you from dragging more spells over than you are able to. There's all kinds of little things. So Fantasy Grounds doesn't prevent anything. It's more or less based off of a gentleman's agreement that, hey, you know, this is what the rules say, but yeah, I'll go ahead and let you have a spell extra. You know, those sort of things kind of come and go, but character creation is really the big B word in most of the rule sets for Fantasy Grounds. The DM side isn't too bad once you get a handle on where things are and how to run combat and such, but character creation, character management, all those things, and sometimes the if you're doing a big campaign and you're trying to world build, that can be a pain in the ass too. But generally speaking, my advice to anyone who's new to Fantasy Grounds or just kind of getting started, learn character creation. I don't care if it's Pathfinder or whatever rule set, learn that, because that's going to be your biggest problem. Because you're going to have people with weird combinations. You'll have people that will add things that don't belong. There'll be, you know, rules that they're not familiar with. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that can go wrong with that. And you may not notice it right away, but you'll see a calculation that doesn't come up right. Or this guy is using a longsword, but his class forbids that. You know, there's all kinds of different things that can come up in play and in building a campaign and working with your players. So they don't always know all the rules. You don't always know the rules, but over time, you'll get the hang of it. And the better you are at building characters, the easier it is for you to spot that, and the more familiarity you get with your rule set and Fantasy Grounds. So learn to build characters. That is paramount to any rule set. I don't care if it's Call of Cthulhu or what. You learn to build the characters, everything else gets a lot easier, especially on the Game Master for managing those things. If you've got to manage everyone's characters and then you're still having problems on top of that because you don't understand the changes that were made or why they work and why they don't work and all those things, that's where the game gets a little bogged down. So just kind of work on building characters initially, because that will help you in the long run. And if you ever play, you'll know what you're doing. So that's just a tip that I learned the hard way. When we first started using Fantasy Grounds, I had no clue how to build characters the right way. I didn't know there was a right way. Didn't know the limitations of Fantasy Grounds and the rule set. So where those things meet in the middle is the part that you're going to have to learn. No one can teach you that. You have to learn the rules, you have to learn Fantasy Grounds, and you have to learn where they meet in the middle. And it's not one for one. Some rule sets are different than others. It just depends on what the rules do, how they work with Fantasy Grounds, and how well they were developed or adapted to the virtual tabletop. So these problems exist elsewhere. If you go to Roll20 or you go to Foundry, same problems, different platform. So you're going to have, maybe you'd be better at doing one thing, but not as good doing another. So regardless of where you go, there you are. So just as a tip, so building characters in Fantasy Grounds is probably the most challenging, time demanding, and thing that requires your kind of babysitting. Everything else is a little bit easier over time. You don't have to worry as much about it. But actually getting the character sheet set up, and if you want automation, you got to kind of slowly build up your understanding of that stuff and how it works. And there are just some things that can't be automated that you have to track. And if you're going to use extensions, then you got to be willing to track down the updates, check them, do the updates. And it can be a real hassle after a while once you start stacking on more than a few extensions. And some people have an extension just to change the way this little picture looks. I mean, I don't even know if that's necessary. But there are some quality of life extensions that will give you a lot of benefit, save you some time. It just depends on what your needs are. But generally speaking, if they're complex, they're likely going to break. I don't care what rule set it is or who's the author. They're going to break sooner or later, depending on when Fantasy Grounds updates and when the author gets around to fixing it, if it can be fixed. There might end up being some dead ends. The other thing that happens occasionally is that if you have an extension that you rely on quite a bit and it breaks and it can no longer be updated, you'll have to disable it. Now, disabling it may stop it from being used, but it doesn't necessarily remove the artifacts that are left over depending on how it does things. So it might have written something to the database that can't be easily removed. So even if you disable it and you uninstall it, the campaign that you're in may still have artifacts left over from when that was in place. So there's some things to consider when you're using extensions to help run your games. So that's kind of getting off into a different direction, but there are extensions that help you build characters. And that's why I brought that up. So I'm using Mad Nomad's automatic actions. I'm using the base core of Mad Nomads, and I'm using this Rob2e module updater, which updates these modules automatically, pulling from a database instead of having to download them and add them to Fantasy Grounds every time. So that's the only real automation I'm using here. There are others that pertain to one specific spell. So you'll have someone who wants to use Mirror Image. Mirror Image is not a fun spell to deal with in Fantasy Grounds without an extension. It can be done, but it all has to be done manually. However, there is one that will kind of help you with it. The only problem is it's subject to break occasionally. And if you don't have a character that has the Mirror Image spell, don't have that loaded. I mean, there's some times where someone will just have a blanket of extensions that they use all the time, but there are some that are specific to a race or a class or a spell or a feature. And if you don't have that in your group, disable it. You don't need that for that campaign. So there are things that can be overwhelming, and it takes a lot of extra management once you start piling on different things to make your game easier. Eventually, it makes it harder because every week you're hoping that these things don't break, or you're just kind of worried that it's going to cause problems down the road and all kinds of stuff. So try to run minimally if you can on extensions. I only have a few loaded just for the sake of demonstration. When I'm done building my characters, I'm going to disable those particular extensions. So I'm going to right click on the desktop and to go to exit session and then return to launcher. That's the correct way to leave Fantasy Grounds. If you just X out up here, you may lose some data. So every 5 minutes, Fantasy Grounds will save. So if I bring up the console, I'll show you what I'm saying. So if you do a right slash, type the word console in the chat window, it brings us up. And if you look at the intervals of how often Fantasy Grounds is saved, there was one at 22 minutes, one at 27 minutes, one at 32 minutes, one at 37 minutes. So every 5 minutes it saves. If you make some changes within that 5 minutes and then you just exit out, you could lose data. So just let you know the best way to save, since you don't know where in time in the cycle of saving that your particular campaign is, if you actually right click and you go to exit session and return to launcher, that's going to help you get away from corrupting data. Or in the chat window, you can do right slash save, and that'll save it up to that point. And then you can X out if you want. But I highly recommend you right click somewhere in a blank background, go to exit session, and then return to launcher. That's the best way to exit Fantasy Grounds. If you just X out, you might lose data or corrupt it. Because if you click on that while it's in the middle of saving, that's generally when it breaks. Now that I have that, if I go to load campaign, now that I'm done building that character, I probably don't need automatic actions anymore because I'm not going to be building characters. However, if you level up, it will pull in whatever content that you need for the level up. Here's this Mr. Roboto, I call it, but it's Roboto font. I have the leather background. I have this link fill, which basically links the book to the automation effect. So if you have like sneak attack and you want to read the description, this link fill will bring in the link from the books that you own and place it in the effect. So when you read it, it pulls in the data. Otherwise, it won't pull the data because you don't own the book. So if you don't have the correct books open, even with the link fill, it's going to give you that error where you need to have X book open at the time. So if you don't need something, you can basically eliminate them as needed depending on your campaign. Once you're done making those changes and you go back into Fantasy Grounds, and start up your campaign and go for it. So I left most of those open because they will be needed when we level up, not during gameplay normally, but during level up. So if I don't remember to turn those back on and it's level 4 and everyone's, wanting to level up, I got to make sure those are active. Otherwise, it's going to break the automation that I want from those particular extensions. Like I said, if you have a spell and you rely on, let's say that there's the rolling mirror image extension. If you have 1 or 2 players that have that spell, yeah, go ahead and load it. But if you don't have that in any of your characters or NPCs, then don't load it. You don't need it. So those are just things that you'll learn as time goes on, like probably less is more type thing. Now that I've come back to the campaign, it's going to let me know if there's any updates. So there's an update column here, and automatic actions was updated recently. So it lets me know what the change log was and when it was updated. And if I click on this, it'll tell me what was changed. So fix the UI, fix the issue with the not working with the Rob2e module updater, fixed a very minor issue, fixed an error. So this is the last version, was fix the issue with module UI. So that's probably due to the theming that's been going on in the background in Fantasy Grounds. They're kind of updating the themes and such. So that's basically the best tips and advice I can give you, especially if you're new, you're not sure how to manage the characters and such. The best way to do that is to make copies of the character before you level up, and then you could export these. So if you want to, the player says, hey, I want to play my character in a different game in a one-shot. I'm familiar with that character. I'm going to be able to use that in a one-shot. Can I use the level 5 version of my character because that's the level it's used? So you can export that for them, send that copy to them, and let them use it somewhere else. Or you can be nice and put all these in a folder for them and send the whole thing to them. That could also include the artwork and the token. Those don't normally travel with the characters. So the XML file, the export, and the token and the portrait, you can put those in the same folder. That way the player has access to it. I wouldn't recommend doing a whole bunch of them like that, but if it's just one character or maybe 5 characters from your campaign, that's not bad. But for every single game, every single player, probably not. But nonetheless, it's up to you how you want to manage your games. But this is just some basic advice for people who are new to Fantasy Grounds. So hopefully you guys have a good weekend. Have a happy new year. I think I'm going to call it. I've been yapping here for probably a good hour. And yeah, 57 minutes. I think that's enough. If you guys have any questions, you can always ask in the video description, or you can come into our Fantasy Grounds Academy Discord. We also have a website. We've got social media, all that stuff. You'll know where we're at. You'll be able to find us. Said Discord is probably the best way to get hold of us, but you can ask through different mediums if you need to. But you guys take care. Have a good one, and I'll see you around. Happy gaming, folks. Bye-bye.